So the first hour is to talk about housing and housing programs specifically. So the intent tonight is we're not going to solve the housing, however we define the housing crisis, the housing troubles, the housing challenges, but mostly to get us all on the same page of what's already going on and how it's trying to be addressed. And through that conversation then, it may elicit from others here some other areas that we're not. The legislature is we're just getting ready to start, and I don't know what the number is, but I have multiple pages already of legislation that's been introduced on housing. And there will be multiple more pages that will be introduced on housing. So from my standpoint, part of it is us and these communities and that trying to be on the same page about where we're at. I think in many cases we read and hear about what some of the challenges and issues are, but when all this stuff starts moving through the legislature, sometimes we kind of lose focus on, so what's already in place and what's working, or if it's in place and it's not working real well, why not? So tonight, we're going to have the conversation about what's in place and how is it working, and especially in our area. And so we have somebody here from the city. Erin is here. We have people here from Home. Wait a minute, get this right. Homes for Good. I'm old enough to call it other things, other names. And then from the State Housing Authority, Claire is here, who's familiar with our community besides. So first, parts of the Heights. Senator Beyer, welcome. First part of the conversation, they will be leading to talk about programs and things they're involved with and what's available out there and some of the challenges that they face. And then we can have some questions and dialogue. But remember, we're not going to solve the problems tonight. But as an elected official that gets overwhelmed sometimes with all this legislation, what's going on, this is helpful for me just to kind of put it all back into context too. So as these pages of bills start going forward in hearings, I don't serve on any of the committees that do the housing hearings and things. So at the end of the day, I have to vote on many of these issues without having the opportunity to have the hearings. And this is, so partly this kind of dialogue helps me also do those things. So Erin, if you would like to start. Thank you again for volunteering to be here.
Welcome. My name is Erin Fifield. I work on...
Maybe it's my age, but I think we need a microphone.
There's three up there if you want to.
For both John and you.
Whoa. Checking.
Yes.
Judy, does that work? Does that work? Okay. My name is Erin Fifield. I work for the City of Springfield in the Housing and Community Development Department. I help to administer the federal grants, working on housing and homelessness issues, and then other housing and homeless issues that come up. There are a number of us who work on those issues. So what I'm going to talk tonight about are the council's housing strategies. There's a handout when you first walked in. There should be still there when you leave. I'll walk through some of these points, but if you'd like more detail, you could either find it on this handout or you can find me or any staff member later on, and we could certainly point you to the right person if you'd like more information. But one of the main points I guess I want to talk about is why we're even looking at housing. Why is our council looking at focusing on housing? And right now we're seeing a limited inventory of homes for sale and homes for rent. And we're seeing the cost of housing through rental prices and through median home values sort of exceeding what a lot of folks in our community would otherwise be able to afford. And so council's main strategy has been, how can we increase the number of housing units? How can we increase the supply in our community, both at rentals, but also homes for sale, so that anyone in our community at any stage of their life, if they're moving up or need to be moving down the ladder of housing, if they are downsizing or their family's expanding, that they can find a unit that's affordable to them at that price. And so that is this goal of the strategy, is to sort of increase housing at all levels. There are other efforts this council is doing related to economic development, bringing new jobs, new companies, expanding growth in town that are certainly related to affordability and housing, but right now I'm just going to talk about increasing the supply. So this first strategy that council is aiming to do is expanding the overnight parking program. Now this isn't necessarily permanent housing, but for those individuals in our community that do not have a place to live, This would give them a legal space to sleep, either in their car or a vehicle. This is a partnership that the city would have with St. Vincent de Paul and Catholic Community Services to administer this program, and partner with local churches, partner with local property owners in industrial zoned areas that can provide sanitation and trash service to someone, and again, give them a legal space to sleep that ideally is just a stepping stone for another place later on. Council has allocated additional resources to this program this fall, and we are trying to increase our outreach to churches and look at, are there other sites in town that we could expand this program and meet the growing need that we're seeing in our community. Another strategy Council is focused on is contributing to income qualified housing development. So the city receives federal funds through the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. The Home Program and the Community Development Block Grant Program provide funds that the city can distribute to developers. And the City Council has prioritized the use of those funds for the creation of new housing units. These units would be designated for folks who are low income and would need to be rented at a rent that would be affordable for someone maybe only making $20,000, $30,000 a year. This is a competitive annual process. The city works with City of Eugene and other partners to distribute those funds. But as a reminder, the city is not a developer. The city is trying to work with developers to say, how can we incentivize others to develop new units? And so with the allocation of those funds, the city is hoping to do that. The city has also recently reinstated the low-income rental housing property tax exemption program that could help the developers of the these projects sort of lower their operating costs over time. So we could exempt property taxes for 20 years for these developments, so long as the projects are rented at an affordable rate to someone who is only making, again, like $20,000, $30,000 a year. An additional effort of council is to encourage the construction of ADUs, also known as accessory dwelling units. This would add to the housing supply while also using currently developed land, currently existing infrastructure. Council is encouraging ADU development by waiving system development charges, which is about $6,000 per year, initially at $6,000 cost, and is also has also amended the development code to make it easier to develop ADUs. Council is also focused on securing property for residential development. This has us looking at our own city-owned property, but also looking with our public partners to see, do public agencies in town have underutilized land that could be used for residential purposes? And so we were talking with Team Springfield, we were talking with those partners to say what is available and are there other ways that we could put it available toward development. And I'd say, finally, for low-income homeowners, the city is prioritizing the use of CDBG funds, Community Development Block Grant funds, to assist low-income homeowners with needed needed repairs to their homes. So this could be a roof that is leaking, this could be a heating system that goes out, but sort of those health and safety needed repairs that may be an expense too large for someone on a fixed income. The city has a program, the home repair program, that is continuing to support to make sure that folks can remain in their home and can remain in a standard of living that meets their needs. Finally, the city, sort of along this housing continuum, is re-looking at the development code. There is a comprehensive development code update project that has started this fall. The city will be looking at all parts of the development review process to ensure that how can we make development more efficient, more timely, and more clear. And the first focus of council and that effort will be toward housing. how do we make housing more efficient, more timely, more clear in the development process? And will that help lower the costs of development? Again, this handout sort of touches on a lot of those efforts. This is meant to be a dynamic strategy. So as different needs come up, as different ideas come up, sort of we'll be working with council to amend their efforts. So I encourage you all to stay involved. There is a link at the bottom of the page to sign up for email updates as it relates to affordable housing. So please continue to participate and share your ideas.
Thank you. So first, I would just like to commend the city of Springfield for the work that they've done and continue to do to address a wide range of things that have to do with housing. Because that's not true in every community in the state of Oregon. And one of the things that we know clearly is even though other communities in the state of Oregon, they want to try to undertake these, everybody has different resources or challenges on those resources. And so one of the things we know about the housing problem in general, this is another one of those issues that separates rural from urban. Because we can do some things in the valley, we can do some things in Springfield. In the valley, in an urban setting, that it just will never work in a rural setting, but it's very hard sometimes with the programs we have to make them work in both directions. So I commend again the city for what they've done and the efforts they've put forth, and it's just kind of one of those ongoing issues that we have to deal with. So now from Homes for Good. So Ella is going to first kind of give an overview of Homes for Good. Okay. And then Steve will talk about some of the things.
Good evening. Thanks for having us here. So my name is Ella Kubok, and I'm the Communications Director at Homes for Good Housing Agency. We are the housing authority that serves all of Lane County, and we've been around since 1949, so we're approaching almost 70 years of serving our community here locally. What we do in a really basic summary is we connect low-income residents with affordable housing through various federal programs and housing opportunities that we create by real estate development, which is what Steve, our real estate development director, will talk about shortly after me. We're currently located at two offices. We have one in Springfield, quite nearby, and one in Eugene. And we're hoping that next year we're going to merge them into one service center, so one place where you'd go to find out about affordable housing opportunities we offer. That would be the old Eugene Library on 13th and Olive, downtown Eugene. So we're pretty excited about that. That's one of our big projects this year. Just some general statistics about who we are and what we do. Our annual budget is about $34 million, and it's predominantly federally funded. We have 92 employees, and in a course of a year, we serve up to 5,000 families and individuals in Lane County in all of our programs. In more detail, what we do, we very actively partner with most local community organizations and nonprofits to build, finance, and develop more affordable housing in our community. We administer the Rent Assistance Housing Choice Voucher program, commonly known as the Section 8. So currently we support about 3,000 families and individuals with rent assistance. We match low-income residents with public and assisted housing units. So overall we have about 1,600 affordable housing units across Lane County, and that's a mix of public housing, HUD project-based Section 8 housing, tax credit properties, and rural development. So that's quite a big number there. A couple of other things we do, we help veterans and seniors and people with disabilities find and secure affordable housing either through our own units or through connecting them with a different local provider or an organization that can help them out. We connect our residents with self-sufficiency programs, and wellness supports. So since 1993, our family self-sufficiency program has created over 115 home ownership opportunities for those who participate. And we've given out over $2 million of funding to families who participate in family self-sufficiency. These funds sort of happen as their rent goes up because their earned income increases, so that's a pretty meaningful program that we have. We also work with our local utility providers to help the low-income community with weatherization improvements that can lower their utility bills or keep their homes just more comfortable. We administer the heat crisis for Lane County. So it's a program that during the winter, if anybody knows a person who does not have heat, they can contact us and our energy services team can get them heat, whether that means getting them a new furnace or repairing their existing system. Overall, what we really want to do in our community is raise awareness about the need for low-income and affordable housing in Lane County. And we know that we can't build it fast enough, so we're working with a lot of different partners and hoping to be a conduit to just creating more of those opportunities. So that's a lot of information, a lot of facts for you, but if you have any more detailed questions, you can find me afterwards. And now I'd like Steve to come and talk about our real estate development pipeline. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Steve Ochs. I'm the Real Estate Development Director for Homes for Good. And I was just going to really quickly hit on some of the kind of local projects going on, some of the strategies we're using to try to address the crisis, and then kind of talk about a little bit about how we're also trying to preserve affordable housing, because one of the issues we're running into is that as we're trying to stay up and catch up with the amount of affordable housing we need, we also have properties at the other end that are 40, 50, 60 years old that are getting so old that they're no longer viable options, and those are starting to compete for money that we could use to build new affordable housing. So yeah, and so the Homes for Good strategic plan calls for us to build 300 more affordable units by the year 2023. And kind of when I'm talking about affordable, in the typical sense, it's units that are affordable for people that are making about 60% of the area median income or less. And so that's kind of the term that we use for that. And so in order to do that, we're seeing, the Lane County is seeing an additional 300 units of affordable supportive units that are needed. And supportive units are even more difficult because those are units that are not only need to be affordable to the person living there, but they need support services. So we're talking about people that are coming out of homelessness, people that are disabled, and populations like that. And so that needs operating cash as well. And so we're working with Lane County right now. There's a project we're working on right across from Watson Stadium. It's called the Commons on MLK. And so that would be 51 units of really small studio-sized units for people coming straight out of homelessness that would have 24-hour support there for them. So, but that's not cheap. And when I talk about affordable housing, also one of the, I guess one of the things people say is, well, it's expensive to build affordable housing, and so the answer is yes to that, because we build it with the the same wood, the same windows, and the same insulation that all the other buildings are getting built with. So the way we can make it affordable is to get a deep subsidy into it at the beginning. And so we work with the state of Oregon, which is actually just starting to put out a lot of money, and we'll see and Carl will talk more about the legislation, because of kind of what we're seeing is the housing crisis is underway. And so so to meet that, we've tripled our development capacity over the last couple of years, which means we went from 1 to 3, which is easy to calculate. But we have several projects coming that are new in the area. There's one locally that, in the Glenwood area that's actually coming very quickly here, and it's been a long time in the making, but we're very excited about that one. There's another one that's coming that's downtown Eugene area, right near 5th Street Public Market, and then there's the property I was just talking about on Martin Luther King Boulevard. But we can't build them fast enough, and our partners can't either. So we have St. Vincent de Paul and Cornerstone Community Housing both build affordable housing in the community also, and it's just really a drop in the bucket from what's needed right now. And I was talking real quickly about the preservation end of things, and so I was saying, that we have Homes for Good has what's called public housing, which is basically it's housing that's on land owned by HUD, and it was mostly done in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, so all of the properties are getting pretty old, and HUD over the years has been providing money to keep them up, but it's just over the years declined and declined. So they came up with a program which was actually very helpful that allows you to convert it from public ownership to a private ownership. And so what happens is they allow you to transfer it into an LLC that's owned by Homes for Good, but then you can leverage loans on it, and which you can't do if it's public housing. And so then you can take out loans on it, fix it up, and start a replacement reserve account in order to keep it up. So so that's going to be our strategy for about half of our portfolio that's really old, that's public housing, that we're going to try to do that over the next few years to help preserve that in the community. And then otherwise, for other older properties, we're just the state has put out money to help with preservation, and we really just have to try to find ways to come up with money to fix up the old units, so we're not losing those off the back end as we're trying to build expensive new units. So, and yeah, I could talk forever, but I know you guys don't want that, so I'm going to step down, and please feel free to come ask questions afterwards if you'd like. Thank you.
So thanks a lot, and the thing that I think is very apparent to all of us is there's no overnight answer, and in fact he talks about 2023 or 2022, and these issues are upon us today, so it takes multiple sectors working on those and strategies in that, but there's no quick way out of the situation we're in, and it really depends on, one of the things it depends on is more money to invest in a lot of different ways. So the state plays a key role in being a partner. HUD, obviously, the federal government has had funds, CBG funds, and there are funds from that, but also the state is becoming a larger partner in the housing issues, but even there's limitations. So Claire is here tonight, and Claire she was with NEDCO in Springfield, so she's well aware of this community. Now she works at the state, and she's here tonight to talk about what we're doing at the state or trying to do to support these local efforts regarding housing. Claire.
Thank you, John. It's really nice to be home to do some sharing of what's happening in Salem. I drive the freeway every day, and I love being able to work here tonight, so thanks for having me. I'm the Assistant Director of Housing Stabilization at Oregon Housing and Community Services, and we are the housing finance agency for the state of Oregon, which means that we are the folks who provide funding for affordable housing development, and we also have community services in the same organization under the same umbrella, which is not necessarily the typical structure for a housing finance agency. We think it's a brilliant structure because we are able to begin to align the development community work with the service community work and really provide, I think, a much more coordinated approach to all of our funding and our strategies. So tonight I'm here to talk about two things. The first one is our statewide housing plan. And this is a 5-year plan that we have been working on for quite a while. In 2017, we went out on the road, 30 different meetings, communities all over the state to get feedback about what was happening on the ground, real time from everybody about their housing needs. And we have worked with all kinds of information and surveys and focus groups and really tried to go deep into the needs of the communities to come up with this first time in a long time 5-year plan. And I hope most of you can at least see a copy. I know we didn't bring enough for everybody, but we have the plan on our website if you want to try to get the draft copy. We found some really great information, and we believe that through our increased focus on data, on this authentic feedback that we've been searching for, and then with our internal staff working on strategy development, we really think this 5-year plan is significant. And we're expecting that in the next 5 years, as we roll it out, we're going to see some pretty dramatic changes in the housing landscape in Oregon. We're hoping that the results of the plan are a clear articulation of our strategies for the state overall around housing and homelessness. We hope that our partners, funders, service agencies all see themselves in this plan, because the one thing we know is that it cannot happen without everybody participating, because it's a complex set of issues that make housing unaffordable and make services so hard to fund. It's going to take us all together to do that. So we believe the plan will give us some really clear direction. We know that data and data-driven decisions and all of that is essential. We need to know what we have and what we're doing and what's working, and so we have really focused on that in the plan as well in new ways. And we as an agency are staffing up and investing in our data infrastructure so that not only can we help ourselves do better work, but ideally we'll be able to share that with partners and do better work with the increased data capacity that we have for ourselves. We also hope that our goals and our metrics that we are calling out and standing behind are meaningful. We want to be held accountable to the work that we do and the work that we fund. So we have a few, for those of you who know sort of the big, hairy, audacious goal lingo, we have some big ones in there that we think are really important and will really move the needle in a number of ways. So I'd be interested to get your take on those as you read through some of the numbers that we're calling out. And finally, we will be putting together an action plan that's very detailed, very specific for every one of the strategies and strategic priorities that we have in the plan, so that every year we can be held accountable to forward progress and deliverables that we have shared out loud with you all on a regular basis over time. So we're really excited about the plan, feel very proud of it. Our governing body meets the 1st of February to approve the final, I think, version of the plan. And I also want to acknowledge that Ariel Nelson is in the audience with us tonight. She is our legislative relations liaison, really, and she is a wealth of information, and I offer her up as a resource for after the meeting or during the meeting, what have you, as we move into the questions. She has been an integral part of putting together our legislative ideas and plan concepts and working with the governor's office on what we believe is an amazing investment strategy from the governor going forward in this next session. So I want to share a little bit about that with you next. Make sure I've covered all of our stuff. So in the 19th session, there are some primary strategies that the governor has called out, which we also, you'll see, mirrored in our plan. To prioritize ending children's homelessness is tops on the list, maybe not because that's the most important thing, but we all know what is happening to our kids. We all know the bad effects of homelessness on children, and we know what that does for our future over time. So we are all very committed to this particular priority. And I say that with passion and love, because that, of course, is the world that I am working in OHCS. So I have a personal connection to that work, and my team is working really hard to come up with new strategies to support that work. We also are focusing on housing Oregon's veterans. We are investing in permanent supportive housing in a way that our agency probably never has before, looking at funding that hasn't been available, and the governor's proposed dollar amount is amazing, and we're really happy to have it as a part of our plan and as a part of her strategy. And the final thing is to accelerate the growth of Greater Oregon's housing supply, and we are specifically in our plan calling out a focus on rural. We know that statewide there are housing issues everywhere. As we did our tour and checked in with big communities, small communities, the housing problems are consistent across the board. So we want to make sure that we, as a state agency charged with providing affordable housing, we want to make sure that we are coming up with unique strategies that impact frontier communities, rural communities, and urban communities. So coupled with the governor's focus on a breadth of housing opportunities, I think we've got a real great combination to make some difference across the state with the work that we're doing. So to get a little bit deeper into the governor's proposal, I want to share with you some of the dollar amounts that she has proposed in her budget and what they're going to fund. So if we look at the priority of ending children's homelessness, there's $298 million proposed in this next biennium. Big investment. 130 million of that is to increase the supply of affordable housing by augmenting funding to the LIFT program, which is the Local Innovation Fast Track program, which we have launched in last biennium, and we are using a new source of funding for that, and we're really proud of the results we've had so far. It's an innovative use of dollars, and the governor is looking to lift that up even more, so to speak. The next one is the $30 million, which is a portion of the doc recording fee resources to provide gap financing for new construction of affordable housing. There's a $50 million recommendation for preventing and addressing homelessness by increasing the EHA and SHAP funding, which is Emergency Housing Assistance and Shelter Housing Assistance Program. And those are the funds that run through the community services side of our agency, and that primarily go to our community action agency partners in Lane County here. And this increase is potentially really life-changing for the folks that we are trying to serve. This could be an ongoing funding source. This is where we provide rapid rehousing services, transitional housing, street outreach, all of those really significant programs to prevent and end homelessness come out of that funding source. So we're very excited to see such a robust increase there over time.
I have a question. Is there more money being funded for that program or the refugees? Because if you want to stop homelessness, you got to quit letting the refugees come in.
So we're going to hold the questions. When we get all through, then we'll have a dialogue and talk about the questions. Sorry.
All right, no worries. Okay, so then we have $20.5 million that's being proposed to address child homelessness in a unique partnership that's brand new between the Department of Human Services and OHCS, where we're going to build a new program structure that it will be a competitive offering, which we haven't done before with DHS, and we're going to be able to provide more comprehensive, no wrong door, wraparound service funding for our partners and for collaboratives that bring together the multifaceted partners it takes to solve homelessness, education, corrections, health. All of those folks will be at the table, hopefully utilizing this funding in a really unique, dynamic way in partnership with DHS. We're very excited about that, and the governor is really supporting us in this innovative effort in a big way, which we appreciate. There's $25 million to preserve 400 units of publicly supported affordable housing and manufactured home parks. I think Springfield, of all places, understands the value of the manufactured home park as an alternative affordable housing type, and we want to be sure that we are all supporting that. So you'll see some strategies in the statewide housing plan around that as well. There's $15 million to see the acquisition of naturally occurring affordable housing, and it's to acquire at least 450 units in multifamily housing properties that offer rents at or below market rate, but don't currently have restrictions. So this shorthand is called a NOAA, so naturally occurring affordable housing is sort of a new approach to ensure that we have some units that are available that aren't necessarily subsidized but are affordable, and we want to keep them affordable over time. We have $7.5 million to maintain the Individual Development Account program, and that's the matched savings program that offers asset education to try to help folks who want to save for some type of an asset to change some sort of a part of their life. Could be a vehicle, it could be a down payment for a homeownership opportunity for first-time home buyers. It could be a small business. It can now be a manufactured home replacement option. And as you go through the educational process and meet the criteria of the program, you're then matched in a savings account 3 to 1. So it's an amazing way for folks to begin to build some wealth and change their circumstance in a way that helps them with their life plan. And we support that program, as does the governor. $20 million is to provide tenant and landlord resources to build successful strategies that help navigate tight, dynamic rental markets, including increasing low-income renters' access to private market rental housing, and to help meet the needs of domestic violence and sexual assault survivors. So this is a new approach to a new set of resources, if you will, to try to support tenants and folks who are having challenges in the rental market just generally. And let's see, the investment in permanent supportive housing that I mentioned earlier is at $54.5 million. So for those of us who have been dreaming of these projects and searching for funding sources, this is really an exciting addition to the governor's budget. We're hoping that it will create 500 new units of permanent supportive housing. It's very exciting. I was hoping that Steve would be like, yeah, that's good. Then we also have $31.4 million to accelerate the growth of the housing supply. We have a housing accelerator program that fits into there. We also have the housing development guarantee account to support rural development, which I think is key. And then we have $1.4 million to provide technical assistance resources through Department of Land Conservation to try to help get communities ready to do more affordable housing development. I think one of the things that we heard when we did our housing plan tour was that the rural communities in particular didn't necessarily have some of the development resources that other communities might have, and we want to really be targeted about getting those resources to the communities that need them. They all need the affordable housing, and if what we need is more technical assistance, for example, we want to be sure to be there to provide that. So overall, the housing budget that's proposed at this point is $406.1 million, which made us all sort of cheer and then go, oh my gosh, we have so much to do. So we're very excited about it. It's a huge opportunity for all of us, I think. Lots of ways to engage in this budget as a community, depending on what your community needs are. And we are happy at our agency to help you in any way that we can. We've got great staff, lots of experience, and part of our strategy and part of what we are doing with the statewide housing plan is calling out our commitment to customer service, if you will. We know that we have a lot to offer, can't do it without you, but we're willing to give you everything we've got to try to help make your affordable housing and your homeless services work better and more effective, and just anything we can do to help, just ask. In that budget of $406 million, if you wanted to look at it, how it breaks down in terms of funding sources, we have about $220 million of bonds that is a part of that budget, $93 million of general fund that goes to OHCS, our agency. We have $93.1 million of other funds that goes some to OHCS, some to OHA, for example, the health authority, and then some that goes to land conservation. So it's a comprehensive package. We're excited to have all those partners included in the governor's budget with us, because we know it's on our side at the state level, it takes all of those partners. And I think that's probably good enough for now, huh?
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'll open it up for questions and discussions, but let me kind of set the stage first from the standpoint of the session and that. So in this session that we will start next Tuesday, we go into session, the leadership has identified 4 priority areas. And by saying 4 priorities does not mean that's all we'll do, but these are 4 very large priorities that are what we call heavy lifts for us in this state to take on, because in many cases they require substantial resources different than what we've done in the past. Housing is one of those. So this is critically important, has been identified, and what Claire described from the standpoint of the governor's leadership and where we should make those investments is very critical. But until we reach the end of the session in June, we won't know for sure what ultimately gets approved in the budget or not, because there's a lot of other issues that will be competing for us. I can tell you across the board of elected officials in the state, though, we understand and heard about housing. We're committed to the role the state will play in those housing issues. and how we can be helpful. We've got to balance that at the end of the day with the resources the state has. So that's kind of the stage. So have some more conversation about housing, get your questions answered if you've got questions while they're still here, and then Senator Beyer and I will talk some about the upcoming session, some of the other issues, and how all this might fit together or not. I just want to reemphasize this journey we're on won't end in 2 years, probably won't end in 4 years. Who knows exactly where it ends? And there's other bumps along the road, and the economy certainly is one of those that can play an impact. If we were to have a recession, if things were to slow down, we're in good times in many cases now from a state revenue and otherwise, but if we hit a bump where those revenue streams slow down, that changes how quickly we can react and what we can do. So that's just part of it. So let's have questions if people have got questions. Yes, sir.
I have a question for that young lady that just spoke.
Okay, Claire.
You spoke about the affordable housing and mobile homes in Springfield. Do you have any idea what the base rent is on a space?
I do not.
Why?
Why don't I?
Yeah.
Candidly, it's not my area of expertise. We've got a whole team at our office who does know that, and they could be up here telling you that exact answer. I know it.
Well, I live in Santiago Baker Estates, East Springfield.
Okay?
We went back to 2013. Our base rent was $440. Today, it's $565. You put in lights and water, and we're well over $600. Lots of my neighbors, their homes aren't paid for. They're paying $1,000, $1,200 a month, space rent, and house payment. That's not affordable, as far as I'm concerned. I've talked to your right-hand man about rent control, and he looked into it, and they're not breaking any rules. They're raising the rate, the maximum amount they're allowed in the time period that they're given. And I talked to Neil. He said talk to the city. I talked to Neil, and he said they're not breaking any rules. They're not breaking any laws. So now I'm talking to you guys. Change the law. Get some restrictions on these people. We have over 200 homes there at $600 a month. Tell me these people ain't making money. See what I'm saying? Help us out a little bit.
That's true. So I appreciate you raising that, and that's just another example of how complex this is. And what you have suggested is for us to pass laws that would restrict how much they can raise the rent or whatever the case may be. Those are parts of the conversation that will go on in the legislature about how we address whether it is in mobile home parks, manufactured home parks, or whether it's apartments or other places for rentals. Different states have taken different strategies, but rent, I want to call it stabilization, rent control, whatever you want to call it, is a strategy some people have pursued. We've talked about it in the last session. That will be part of this session. We don't know where they'll end up and how effective. That's why we'll have the conversation. But I appreciate what you said about manufactured homes and being affordable or not, because certainly that's getting to be the same kind of structure, especially if the underlying rent and utilities things are that costly and people don't own their homes. So that's certainly on the agenda. We probably have several bills that have already been, in fact, I know we do, several bills that have already been introduced to try to address some of those things you've described there. But where any of these will end up, whether they'll even get a hearing or not, and if they get a hearing, whether they'll move forward and ultimately get approved by the House and the Senate, or the Senate and the House and signed by the governor, that's what this session will be about, this conversation. So.
A question for the Homes for Good folks. How well are we doing on our Section 8 covering the demand for that locally? Because I know nationwide that's a big problem.
Yes. So I think I mentioned we, with the funding we have, and we received up to, I think, $17 million this year. That allows us to serve about 3,000 families and individuals. And the way this works is if our market and the rents in the market are super high, if we continue down the road, we might be forced to serve less than 3,000 people because our $17 million only goes thus far. And in terms of meeting the demand, the last time we opened our Section 8 wait list was in May 2017. and we received over 4,600 applications, out of which a lottery was ran to be able to serve the 3,000 that were able to fund serving. So I think the demand between all of the providers in our local community, everybody has very long wait lists, and we always hear that there isn't enough housing. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but that's the context.
Gary, did you have
Not on this issue,
Okay.
but on the subject of the mobile home park.
Yes, thank you.
Because that's a difficult issue around the state, and especially in Springfield. And the Springfield Council and the mayor have been, and staff have been very progressive in terms of trying to address the aging of mobile homes in the Springfield area and the desire to have some of the parks redeveloped, but to still offer home ownership opportunities. And I know that the Housing Council that's advocating for this is asking for some funds to be introduced to make sure that there's a way to take down the older mobile homes that are pre-76 and often cost up to $10,000 per to take them down. So the homeowner has no way to afford to do that, or often on fixed incomes. But the second half of that question, or that comment, is now a question. And that is, there is an opportunity that Springfield would like to pilot a program to actually develop a new park, or two, or whatever, in order to allow those homeowners that are currently in substandard housing the opportunity to either move, or if they can't move their unit, to purchase new units in a park that would be affordable to them, to keep those rents down, which wouldn't have the problem of the constant escalating rents. I don't know where that is in the discussion, but I believe you were part of that discussion. Could you comment on that, please?
Certainly. So that's one example. After the mayor contacted us and talked with TerryNet about what's, again, available to support to try to create that, because there's a site, there's opportunity now, there's an opportunity here. And how do we do it in a way that makes it cost effective when we get done? And so it takes multiple things. We met with the Housing Authority, we talked about existing programs. In some cases, the existing programs don't fit, as Terry can tell you, don't fit very well to do it. We've got what we call a placeholder bill to try to address, if we can identify the strategy forward, to move some funds, to identify some new funds to do specifically what he has described there, because it's an opportunity that's now, and we know there's a need in this community. But again, it goes back to, I don't know how quick any of that's going to happen. I will comment that I do know that Representative Pam Marsh from Ashland has introduced several bills dealing with manufactured housing. One of those has to do with rehabilitating, so making funds available on that for those that can be rehabilitated and preserved, to make funds available to help do that. Secondly, to help again in the replacement then, if we have to get to the point they have to be replaced. So there's a range. I know that Representative Julie Fahey is also working on some of those issues, because there's many manufactured homes in her district. So there's a lot of, again, conversations going on and efforts being made that will be part of what happens in the legislature. But I'm just going to go back to, so even if we get some of those approved, that won't occur until after July, once the fiscal year starts, and then the process to implement and start doing those things. So in many cases, it's a year from now before we could start doing that. I mean, we risk not getting things done, but unfortunately, that's the way the process works from a standpoint of the state's involvement. But there is a lot of effort going into it, and if there was a way to speed it up, I think Senator Beyer and many of us would love to find a way to speed it up. And if you or somebody else identifies that in the short term, we're open to those conversations. So, yeah.
Does anyone know about the fourplex proposal that's the speakers brought forth in the legislature? That would be quite a game changer.
So thank you for bringing that up. I have that right here. So I'm going to go back to, there's multiple pages that have already been presented on bills to try to address the housing issue in the state of Oregon. And I can tell you every elected official probably has a different strategy that they might think might work. And they might work in some communities or not. So what the speaker has talked about it. So part of the, well, there's several issues, but one of the issues is available land. Ed sitting here can tell us that that's an ongoing challenge for us in being able to create. So available land, and so the land we've got, how well are we utilizing it, or what can you do? And so one of the things the speaker and others have introduced legislation that would change R1 zoning from what is currently at, where R1 zoning is single-family residential, to open that zoning up, where it could be duplexes, fourplexes. It's a range of things that could be built in R1 zoning that in many cases are not allowed in R1 zonings now. I know years ago, and I don't know the city of Springfield today, when I was in the city of Springfield, we could do duplexes on corner lots in R1 zones, and I think that's still the case in some communities. But this would change that to allow more multiple family type dwellings in R1 zones throughout the state. That's one concept that we'll be considering, but part of the issue is, again, the availability of land and locations to put housing, and especially affordable housing, that people can afford to live in. But yes, that's the speaker, and I think the Senate, I think she's got a co-sponsor in the Senate for that particular legislation. Yeah.
My name is Corey Rodley, and I live here in Springfield, and I have a question for the Homes for Good folks.
Okay.
You mentioned that your goal is to build 300 affordable units throughout the county, and I was interested if you have come up with what your intended distribution of those units are. Are they Eugene, Springfield? Have you made a plan to go throughout the county?
The answer is yes. I guess our current pipeline has mostly Eugene, Springfield. We just got funded for a very small project in Cottage Grove and are talking to the city about a project there on an old school site possibly. And then we were really interested also in hearing a lot about Florence and the rental the rental problems they're having there, and so that's also going to be one of our priorities. So really I guess overall the priority is to reach out more now and get out more in the rural communities and Crestwell, Cottage Grove, Oak Ridge, Veneta to the coast. So we haven't been, but we're going to start. We currently have properties in all those locations. We have a few in Florence, a few in Cottage Grove, Crestwell, none in Oak Ridge at this point though, and none in, no, we do have one property in Veneta also. So, and so I guess the answer is yes, but I don't have a lot of specifics, but that is one of our goals.
A couple of quick questions. The 406.1 billion, if that were approved at the end of the session, how much of an increase is that? I think it needs to be substantial to move the needle. That's why I'm asking.
I don't have the total increase amount, but just to give you perspective, so previous funding, for example, one of our major development resources, Lift, the governor's proposing 130 million. Last biennium was 80 million. The biennium before that was 40 million. So the legislature has really been stepping up to really recognize the need across the state, and so the governor is really encouraging that momentum, really focusing on supply, but also on the services side, the $50 million ask for the emergency housing assistance, homeless assistance funds. Those programs have been significantly underfunded historically. The baseline budget has been $10 million. Last biennium, the legislature awarded a historic total of $40 million. So, and the significance of that is that it's really difficult for our local partners to plan ahead when they're only getting one-time money. Last biennium, it was one time. It's hard for them to plan ahead, bring on the proper staff, infrastructure, and so in that $50 million, that's the governor's asking for that to be ongoing, continued service level funding to allow communities to really get to the need and plan ahead and continue to reach the folks that need it.
And Ariel, the doc reporting.
Yeah, so another significant increase, thank you, John, is last biennium, the legislature approved tripling the document recording fee, which is a statewide fee that funds the spectrum of housing need from the emergency housing assistance to homeownership, repair and rehab, down payment assistance to get folks into the homeownership market. And then the majority of it is in the general housing account program, which funds both the development of new affordable housing, preserves existing affordable housing like the folks at Home for Good. It also helps preserve manufactured home parks. And the other part of the document recording fee is a quarter of each of those programs is reserved to serve veterans for their housing needs. So we're able to actually build communities specifically to serve veterans. Those are just some examples. We also use those development funds to help pencil out developments around the state that need just a little bit of extra gap financing. because we know affordable housing can be tricky to build. And so it's a really valuable resource. And so some of those funds are requested or are reflected in the governor's budget in that total of 406.1. But it is a historic ask, but it's also reflecting what the legislature has been investing in the previous biennium. So we're really hopeful to continue that momentum. I think folks are certainly aware that housing is not just an urban and a rural urban issue. It's, it may look slightly different and there may be different solutions, but the governor's budget kind of takes that into account and recognizes that we need a bunch of different strategies, and we need to make sure that we're partnering both among the state agencies, with our local partners, and leveraging, private and federal investment as well.
Thank you. And my next one, more for Steve and Terry, back on the land supply. Thank goodness for the projects you have going now, but do you have any concern on where future locations are going to be in the Eugene-Springfield area?
I could say yes for myself.
Cheaper places in the Eugene-Springfield area?
Are you concerned about finding land for affordable housing development in Eugene-Springfield?
Ed, you and I have had this discussion more than once. And that's about my favorite. So you have to move toward the opportunity-based properties out there. So, for example, the Lane County Commissioners recently identified a piece of property on 99 that they owned and that went to auction, a C2 zone piece of property where the current Camp 99 is, and it's now moving up to my facility up there north of that. But that property was put on the market, wasn't bid on, and yet you could build about 50 to 60 units of housing on that site if you chose to. So there are opportunity areas out there if you're willing to take advantage of the zoning type. So we own a piece of dirt tomorrow that I'll sell you for $300,000, but you can put 50 units on out River Road. How's that?
Wow. Let's get her done.
Yes.
Yeah, for the clinic. I'm just wondering if there's one of the buildings floating around with the restrictive and no cost eviction, and I'm wondering if we can count on you to support that.
So, again, multiple bills, and asking anybody in the legislature today before we've ever started whether we can support it or not, until both we've read the bills and secondly we've had hearings on the bills to understand where they'll end up, is a pretty difficult question. I supported the bill in the last session that didn't ultimately pass. Whether I will support the bill this time remains to be seen until we know what the final bill is, until we understand what the implications of that are. And I know John's been working on this particular issue, but there's a lot of things attached besides just saying no-cause evictions. I appreciate the concerns around that and the problems it creates. But I can't tell you today, before the session's even started, without having legislation that we're ready to vote on, whether I can vote on that legislation and support what that might be. We'll just have to wait and see where that ends up. Yes?
I have a question for Claire. Hi.
Hi.
I've been involved with some projects serving youth aging out of foster care and transition age youth. And my question is, does any of that funding account for ongoing operational costs?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
That's always a question. Yeah, I think one of the key things I want to say is, talked about the increases in the investments that we made last biennium and doing this, but another key part of that conversation is maintaining them over time. Because remember that we're doing this at a biennium at a time, but this is a long-range problem, and if we can't provide the certainty for the local jurisdictions and people doing this, it becomes very difficult to see the results going to the end. So part of the conversation we will have at the legislature is, yes, we will do these if that's where we end up, and maybe even more. The legislature could decide to put more into those programs if we decide prior. But the other part of the conversation is, are we comfortable, do we have the income streams in that we can identify that we can maintain or continue even increasing these programs over the longer term? Because otherwise we get out of biennium, when we stop it, the problem only gets worse again. So that's part of the conversation. Yeah.
I had a question for Claire. You had mentioned that the $20 million of the 406 allocated to landlord tenant resources, and you mentioned domestic violence survivors. How is that money earmarked, or what's the vehicle to get that money into domestic violence survivors' hands?
I'm going to let our expert here.
So, yeah, this is a new funding pool.
Could you go up to the
microphone? So, the $20 million is intended to be a funding pool to address a variety of strategies. And for domestic violence survivors and sexual assault survivors, all of the $20 million, the agency would be putting out an RFP process And so different providers around the state could be applying, and it would be structured around the different strategies that we mentioned. And one of the needs that, that the agency and the governor's office heard around domestic violence survivors and sexual survivors is that, in this increased housing, the pressure on the housing market, the housing crisis, it means that folks at all levels are really in unstable housing situations. And so these would be flexible resources for existing providers and that serve domestic violence survivors to be housing navigators to help them get into stable housing. They may need some emergency assistance, some down payment assistance and the like to get into an apartment. But it's for those specific providers that are trauma informed to help connect them to housing resources and get them what they need.
So Claire.
Hi, Jerry.
One of the issues we as a larger community, the metropolitan area, is singles homelessness. And for reasons that are somewhat mysterious to me, we're now housing up to about 200 people a night in 10 South Highway in north of Eugene. And what we're very interested in doing is dealing with next winter, because we don't believe this problem is going to go away in the next 8 months. And so we have a strategy on how we can go ahead and develop about 60 units of housing on that site and get it actually placed this year. And we've looked at the lift funds about 4 times, but it always comes down to the inside of MSAs, we just can't use it unless it's for a population of color. Is there a way to deal with the agency to find a way to get this for homeless services for transitional housing?
Yes, I think maybe. Let's start there. We've added a new use for our EHA funds for real estate development, and this sounds like maybe it could be a fit for that program. We're sort of retweaking it now, and feedback from you about what you need and what it would look like would be really helpful to us, like maybe this week or next week would be awesome. Yeah, so I think that's a possibility, absolutely. We recognize the needs are kind of unique, yeah.
I'm wondering about creating housing for minimum wage workers, and are your state funds maybe going to be available for SROs or tiny houses like Emerald Village, Square One Villages, which have rents to ownership of like $300 a month, that actually low-income people can take that first step out of homelessness, that haven't been homeless so long that they're broken?
So I think the answer is yes on that one too. I think what you need to think about is what partners are appropriate for developing a project like that, and then working with our staff to align our funding sources to whatever the project looks like overall. So I think that there are some opportunities there. It just sort of depends on the details of how you put it together and that sort of thing. But yeah, I think we're open. I think we're recognizing there are needs of all kinds that maybe have not been traditionally funded, and we're looking at our funding sources to be more innovative and more flexible, I think, than ever before. And we're open for conversation.
Yes, John. So could Homes for Good comment on the impact of the federal shutdown on housing choice voucher payments?
Yes. We're monitoring the situation very closely, because I'm sure that many of you have heard that while the government is in a shutdown, we have funding all the way through February through a resolution that was passed right before in December. Right now we're not impacted, and when I say that, I mean the programs that we administer, so both the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program and the public housing and other forms of housing that we currently own and manage is not impacted. However, some of our projects that are in the middle of getting financing or development, who need different types of HUD approval or process to go through, the the fact that HUD has been shut down has affected those projects and put a lot of stress on how are we going to be able to finance some of them. So while the federal programs aren't affected, new development right now is affected to some degree.
But to be clear, the voucher program payments are good through February.
Through February, right now.
The shutdown continues. There will be no housing voucher payments in March.
So, well, it's not that simple. So what we're doing is really looking at what would that look like. And as soon as we have an answer for the community, what we currently do is just have a simple statement on our website, but we also update our social media channels. We can't answer that question right now because we don't really fully have the unpacked situation. We're hoping that the shutdown will not continue, and we're definitely preparing for what does it look like for our community and for our programs if it does. So it just takes some time and analysis to really dig into what could the impact be for us.
Another example of how complex this is and how interdependent, because obviously federal funding and programs is a vital part of this whole partnership, and who would have ever thought that we would be in this situation where there'd be the risk that there is, that they could reach that. So I appreciate the work they're doing and communicating with people, but I can also appreciate the concerns people might have, individual people in that they're in those situations and where they might be in another month or so if the shutdown doesn't change. So, yes, ma'am.
So I'm Carmel Snyder. I represent AFB Oregon, and we hear often from a lot of families and from retirees. And following up on this lady's question, what are we doing about housing that is affordable? We're not talking about homeless people. We're not talking about really low income folks who need subsidized housing, but there's still this gap of housing that is affordable for the average wage earner in Oregon. So what is being done to increase that type of housing?
Well, I don't know who's got the answer. I think, Erin, we talked about some of the city trying to identify sites in that might become available to it, but part of that issue goes back to the land that's available. It goes back to the costs to develop the land. It goes back to a tax structure that we have in the state now that's put communities in a position that they can't have property taxes to pay for things before, so now we have system development charges and we have fees and things that raise the cost. And I know Senator Beyer and all, we've heard stories at the legislature in different communities. In some cases, if you add the cost, and this is land that's there, in some cases it's not as constrained as some of the ones we have here. You add the cost of the land, the infrastructure improvements, and the system development charges and that, you're up to almost $200,000 before you start building a house. It's very hard to start at $200,000 and build what you're trying to describe, which is housing. Now, I know there's people working on other strategies. Again, smaller homes, there's all kinds of tries to get at it, but at the end of the day, part of it is market driven. And we've reached, in many cases, and understand I'm a strong supporter of land use planning, but we've reached in many cases kind of the saturation point of what we were trying to do with land use planning and how we could do that. The other thing you have to appreciate that not all of us agree on living closer together or in multi-story buildings and that, but density in many cases is how other communities in that were able to address it. So those are a lot of ongoing issues. I go back to the proposal from Tina, Speaker Kotek and others about putting more units, multiple units into those R1 zones. Hopefully it would be one way to address both number of units and the cost, since you're dividing that cost up over more number of units, but I don't think there's a simple answer.
So I Representative wanted to note that thanks partly to the encouragement of home builders, both Springfield and Eugene have processes underway to look at things they might do to their development codes to make it cheaper
right.
to build, easier to build, more units at a lower cost.
Yeah, that's right. Erin mentioned that. Sorry. You're right. Thank you. Yes.
Well, I have a question that's kind of the opposite of this question from AARP. Since there are so many federal and state programs that allow government funding and spending on incomes up to 80% of the area median income, which is up in the 30,000s, well, we have 50,000 people around here in Eugene and Springfield who are living at 25% of the area median income. The 50,000 people who are living on $1,000 a month, that's $12,000 a year. And so my question is the opposite. Why aren't we focusing all the spending on the most desperate levels of the spectrum?
It's a very valid question. That'll be part of that's the conversations that we have on an ongoing basis, since there's not enough funds in total, there's not enough funds to address these places. And so when we talk about the strategies of where we spend those funds, I've been in many of those conversations, and Senator Beyer will have those conversations again about the limited funds we have. Where can we be most effective with those in the near term and affecting the people that really need to be? That's a very valid question, absolutely correct. But again, there's no simple answer because there isn't enough. We can't do enough in the short term regardless, even if we had all the funds in the world, because you couldn't invest them and do that. But you can't do enough in the short term to address all of them. So it kind of goes back to priorities. And those priorities are different in different communities. So we talked about in Eugene, Springfield, Lane County. I can tell you they're different in small communities in rural Oregon in many cases, but there's still issues there that we need to try to address. So no simple answer.
Are there, has directed efforts to combine commercial development with these new housing initiatives? I mean, you could, through zoning or other things like that. Is there, because as you build more housing infrastructure, you tend to need more commercial areas around them, or supporting them, or building on top of them or below them, to make sure that people have access to groceries and other necessary components. So I was just wondering if these agencies had focused on, I understand the support system for homeless people transitioning, and that's fantastic. But are we going to see more commercial structures or commercial initiatives that are going to be able to support long-term the growth and investment in the residential housing?
So
Sure. One of our projects right now that's kind of happening off 6th Street by Fifield Public Market.
Microphone.
Depending on my booming voice. And so I think the answer is yes, though, on a kind of several different levels. One of our projects right now is going to be above a commercial space in downtown Eugene, kind of an area where you basically could walk anywhere you wanted, and we're not even providing parking for it because we're hoping that people will be able to use other modes of transportation. So I think that's the ultimate goal, but finding, that kind of, and financing those kind of things are much more complicated. We have to build this kind of condo structure. We're actually end up paying prevailing wages because of the height of the buildings higher and kicks into some different types of construction and that kind of thing. But ultimately, it's the best place for anyone would want to live there. You have all your services right there. The way the state structures when you go for their funds, any competitive funds, they always look at a lot of those things to make sure you're, grocery, schools, transit, that you're really locating your projects in really good places. And then I guess to the last question, I also add the state also this last round, they did to serve kind of the less than 30% area median income. They actually also gave you higher scores if you served the lower income, and it resulted in I want to say 300 new units through the state that were less than 30%. But it was a big jump from what. Yeah, but it was a big jump from what had happened in the last funding round. So, for example, one of our projects ended up with 15 units for 30% of area median income or less, and then the rest were we call workforce, but we're up to 60%. You still, at 60% still people, you make a little more than minimum wage, you can barely qualify. So there still is that gap. Once you make it a little bit more than that, then there's still a pretty big gap to when you're hitting the market rate rents. But I was kind of all over the place there, but hopefully I answered your question. So.
I just wanted to voice support for Speaker Kotek's proposed legislation to allow miscellaneous housing by right on every lot. I think it really hits the nail on the head in terms of addressing the issue of a lack of supply of housing as being the root cause of the housing crisis. When I recently moved from Portland, and I had one criteria. I wanted to live in a walkable neighborhood, which meant the old inner areas for the most part. And every single house I lived in, I ended up renting, was a currently illegal to build housing type. It was 2 mid-block duplexes. It was an old house that in the 1920s during the serious depression was converted to a quadplex. These were housing types that we don't have anymore. They're illegal now to build, and to allow us to build them, to allow homeowners the opportunity to bring more housing into their properties, costs us nothing. It's not taking up government dollars, it's not taking up subsidies. So I think that's a real lack. I don't hear enough about that conversation brought forward to these community discussions often. So just want to emphasize support for that.
I appreciate that. There will be more of these conversations. So another part of the conversations is, I'm going to repeat, communities are different. And one of the things that's always a balance is, does the state dictate to every community across this state what they're going to do in those zones or not do in those zones? Or does the state set some standards and allow communities through their own process then to make those choices based on land use laws? I mean, so that'll be part of this conversation about the speaker's proposals and others. Will be one, how does it apply across the state? Secondly, is that a role the state should play in telling communities that's the way you should do it, versus making whatever we have to change at the state level from a flexibility so then communities can have that conversation and do it. But that'll be part of the conversation, but I appreciate that. But I, again, appreciate the speaker and others reaching out and trying to create the conversation about some other ways to look at how we deal with this, because in the near term, the land we have is the land we've got. We're going to have to make whatever we do with that land we've got. Yeah.
I want to talk about the urban growth boundary. Can you give me arguments why we're not looking into expanding the urban growth boundary where the land is relatively much cheaper and larger plots?
I can't respond to that. I see one of our council members, so that's a local decision. It's based on land use laws state passed, but expansion of the local urban growth boundary now is a decision that goes through the local process. And that I know Springfield recently did an expansion, at least for industrial land.
Industrial land. We approached the state and asked to expand residential, as Eugene did as well, and we were denied. They said we had enough land within the urban growth boundary at the time, and so they look at our population, you know, and they determine based on what they say our population is going to be in 20 years. So it's not that we didn't try, we did.
In every session, there's multiple bills also introduced regarding land use planning and how we might change land use planning from the state's perspective, how we might make it less restrictive, more restrictive, change it. That will certainly be on the agenda again this time, especially given this conversation and some other conversations we're having, issues besides housing that have to do with restrictions in cities. But at the end of the day, it takes at least 31 votes in the House, 16 votes in the Senate, and the governor to sign it. And that's not a simple process to get through. And this is not making an excuse, only telling you that, again, we in this room might agree, we might have a strategy we would agree with, but that does not mean our friends in Corvallis or LeGrand or Baker City would agree. And if the legislature has to balance those things and then come up with that strategy in the short term, and that's why we go back every year now, but every 2 years, and keep looking at it. But that's the last several sessions. We tried last full session an attempt to set aside a larger chunk of land in 2 or 3 communities that was outside of the urban growth boundary, but was available for services in that, to see if having that big chunk that was undeveloped in that could help start housing and development in that. I don't know where we stand. I think Ben was one of those.
So I can answer that.
Can you? Thank you.
Springfield looked at it, but decided it didn't fit.
It's pretty expensive, East Springfield.
Yeah. So Springfield looked at it. You all did pass a bill that allowed 2 cities,
right,
one over 25,000 and one under 25,000. I think there weren't any applicants under 25,000. There were 2 over 25,000. Redmond and Bend, oddly enough, competing. And LCDC just last month chose Bend, and you will see bills next month from Representative Stark,
yes,
who was the sponsor originally,
right,
suggesting that maybe we ought to have 2 cities both over 25,000. So Redmond could.
So right, I thought we'd done that. Bill.
That's an experiment.
Right.
I think we can thank Representative Terry Beyer for introducing a bill that separated Eugene and Springfield in terms of the urban growth boundary, because we in Springfield had to have Eugene agree for us to expand. Now Eugene likes compact growth. So Terry carried that bill in the House, I carried it in the Senate, and we determine our own urban growth boundary now.
Correct.
Yeah.
So I don't want to cut this conversation off, but this is tied to, so whether we're successful or not in coming up with new investments in housing is related to several other issues that we're going to have to address in this session. So remember I talked about one of the 4 priorities was housing. Well, the other 3 priorities, again, those aren't the only, but the big issues that we're trying to make sure we get through in this session. The other 3, one of those is Medicaid, and ensuring people, we continue to have a Medicaid program to keep people insured and access to health care. And that's not as simple. That's about $1 billion of money we have to come up to fill that gap, so that with the federal funds we have in that, we keep people insured and they have access, the children covered, the families, and so on. So that's one program, that's one of those priorities. Another one is funding of education. And we've all heard that and heard that and heard that for us that have lived here a long time. The Speaker and the President of the Senate appointed a joint Student Success Committee, which has spent the summer touring the state and talking to citizens, residents, students, educators across the state about that particular issue and identifying some strategies. If we have more revenue, where could we invest that revenue to get the most out of that incoming revenue? So that's going to be a very critical conversation coming in. I can just tell you, when they completed their first round and had some of their first conversations and put out kind of their wish list, that was $3.5 billion of new money. They recognize, and I've just been appointed to that committee, they recognize we won't get $3.5 billion in new money. But we have a wide range of things, and the nice thing about that is we've identified both in rural and urban and so on, what might work in some places different than here, where we put those funds. But that's going to be a very important conversation. And that conversation was really around 0 through 12th grade. So birth through 12th grade, it did not necessarily include community colleges and higher education four-year institutions, which need funding also, but that was not necessarily part of that. And then the 4th area is climate change and carbon reduction, and Senator Beyer and I serve on the Carbon Reduction Committee, trying to address the impacts of climate change in our state, and what we can do regardless of what people think about the size of this state and our impact globally or nationally. We need to be doing things here, and I think we all see some of those impacts around us in the fires, the drought that 90% of this state faces. There's some huge challenges there, and we're trying to find a path forward that we can address climate change and how that impacts all of you. And I know Senator Beyer and I have talked about this. So one of the biggest contributors to carbon is fossil fuels. That means our cars that we drive, our cars that we drive. So if we're serious about starting to diminish carbon in our state, we have to be serious about using less fossil fuels, and whether it be to produce energy, whether it's to drive our cars. But the other side of that then becomes, how does those costs, because that will increase costs, so how do those costs impact all of us and all of everybody here in the state? We just passed the transportation package and raised gas taxes. This potentially could be an increase in gas taxes, and by Constitution is restricted to the road fund. We can't spend those things on housing or jobs. We have, well, they could be jobs, they could create jobs. But that's another part of it. That's part of this big picture of the 4 big things we're trying to deal with that all involve both money, needing more money, but also costs to all of the citizens in our state, one way or the other, in order to provide those programs. So, Senator Beyer, do you want to make some comments? I keep talking about Senator Beyer, but I'll let him speak for it.
Well, we all owe Representative Lively a big hand for putting this into this. As you've heard, I was listening to all of this, and I spent most of my early years in Springfield on the Planning Commission dealing with these housing issues. Went up to the legislature, retired from that, came back here and was on the Planning Commission again, and then I retired and went back to the Senate, and the issues don't change very much. I think we're very fortunate in this community to have 3 very good not-for-profit agencies that are trying to address the low-cost housing thing. And they're outstanding and much better than most of the rest of the state. Largely it's because we've got an urbanized area that they can do, and they can do good work. One of the pieces that I think you didn't address very well is the fact that even if you have all the money, right now it's very expensive to build things because there's no labor. And that's one of the issues. I know Terry's working on the mobile home park idea, which I think is a great idea. I actually think of that when I was in the Air Force many, many years ago. I lived in, that was one of the solutions that the Air Force came up to in the middle of the Nevada desert where I was put in mobile home parks, and they did it in about 3 months, and all of a sudden they took care of a lot of their lower enlisted people's needs there. So it can be done, and they're less expensive. You don't have to deal with the land costs that he's talking about. John Van Lanningham has been at the forefront of trying to deal with the renters issues and mobile home issues forever. There's been ongoing things. A lot of the laws that you're talking about, they may not be stringent enough, but they've come out of some very tense discussions. One of the issues we have is when those things turn over, people pay more for the land, and then they have a constitutional right to get a fair return on their investment, and that makes it problematic to do that. That's where the $10,000 kind of, if you do away with the park, that was a big issue in the 90s, was the land was more valuable to sell for housing than to keep in rental lots, and we actually stopped that through some of that issues. Then we had the recession, and you kind of got out of that for a while. But John's right. A lot of this stuff is very good, and one of the concerns about the housing issue, the money that Claire was talking about, is a big piece of that over the last few biennia are bonds. And people often forget that bonds are not free money. The state has to pay that money back. So while we have an initial influx of money to build stuff, which is good, it starts eating into the operating revenue because you got to pay more back on it, just like your house mortgage, for those who have one of those. You know, we are fortunate in Springfield, and I will say that in terms of our council's direction over the years. We have allowed for, ever since I've been involved, duplexes on corner lots in any single family development. The street I live on, it's actually 2 blocks long, has 3 duplexes on one end, and it's got 2 on the other end, and in between there's a house that has a granny flat, or ADU as we call them now. And right across from me I have 2 families move in, one disabled that built their new house, and they built a studio over the garage, and it's been rented forever, and it works just fine. We didn't have any trouble with it at all. Great neighbors. Yet down on 5th Street by Fred Meyer, they're trying to build an apartment house, and you think you were pulling everybody's teeth to get an approval to do that. It is not easy to build things in any community. One of the issues we're going to have to deal with is the fact that we used to subsidize, Ed and I were talking about this the other day, if you go back before 1990, cities tended to subsidize development cost. When we passed all of the property tax measures, well warranted, cities didn't have an option. They started doing a user pay system. Real cost, somebody has to pay, and we've shifted it to the user. And I think what we're seeing now is that we have those costs are going up where it gets very difficult to build workforce housing, because it's hard to get that amount done. You know, the old rule of thumb used to be, I don't know if it is anymore, Ed, that your land cost, it should be 1/3 of the cost of the final house. So if you're spending $200,000 on land, you just priced it, I mean, $200,000, you priced it out of the reach of most people in minimum wage jobs, and you certainly priced it at the higher level. It's very tough. So our land use issues are that we're going to have different kinds of housing than we've had in the past. There's a lot of discussion about that. Some of it gets back to the ways we hook up utilities. I know Ed and I were talking last week about an architect that tried to do what we used to call, I was trying to think, it's cluster development with common utilities, and the utilities wouldn't let him, so they quadrupled the cost of the utilities for the thing and made the project unaffordable. We just have to look at that, and I think in Springfield, our council is trying to consider those things and figure out how do you do that. It's just you're gonna have to do it differently. So, enough on housing. John hit on the big issues, and I guess the one thing that kept ringing in my ear, I'm on what's called the Ways and Means Committee, which is the budget committee for the legislature. First time I tried to avoid it all the while I was in the legislature, but they put me on it this time, and primarily my responsibility is funding for human services and health, including health care on that. John hit the big issue. We've got to figure out a way to do the health care budget. As Oregonians, we can be proud of the fact that 94% of all Oregonians now have one form or another of health care. That's the good thing. And what I've been saying is that we've got now, for people on the lower economic scale, we have pretty good health care coverage. For people that are affluent, they can take care of themselves. It's the people who are working in the middle that have insurance, usually provided by their employer, but it's at a rate, when you consider the co-payments and the limitation, that they can't afford to use. And we have to address that, and we're trying to. Keeping the Medicare thing in place, which was a good law. When we did that, the federal government, initially under the Affordable Care Act, paid 100% of that, and the agreement was that they would ratchet it back to 90% over time. Well, that's where we're hitting now. We're down to, we got one more payment, or one more ratchet down, but we'll come up with, it's actually not $1 billion, but it's about $700 million that we have to cover that cost. How we do that is we have assessment on hospitals and healthcare providers and insurance companies, and we have to renew those. And that pretty much, there's a general agreement, there's a stakeholders group that's been working on that, and we think we're very close to covering that with that, which will be good, because the other general fund commitments, as John was saying, we're trying to do a lot more in education, among other areas. And one of the things you heard in the paper, before Christmas was about foster care, and that report from the Secretary of State about the inadequacies of that system was absolutely right. It's been right for about 20 years. The problem is money. Well, it's actually, there are two problems with that. One is finding people who are willing to be foster parents. I used to do that myself. And the other one is finding the money to have adequate staff to make sure that those kids are taken care of well in the system. And we haven't done a good job with that. We've overloaded the caseworkers, and as a result, we have a continuing turnover, which is really expensive in trying to find people. So lots of problems. John said four big issues, and that's correct. That doesn't include the other. We'll get about 4,000 bills during the session. All of them are important to someone, but most of them are not important to everyone. So we'll be dealing with that. A lot of it just has to do with keeping the business of Oregon going, whether it's insurance laws or car dealership things or farm equipment. So we have all of that. Wineries, wine bills we've got. I've been working with our distiller that's trying to open down here at the end of Main Street, trying to allow the small businesses to get going again. So there's lots of demands out there, lots of interest, and you'll see a lot of it in the paper. I will tell you, there's always this vision in the paper of how the legislature doesn't get along in the conflict, kind of like Congress, although we're better at it. Better than 95% of all the bills that are considered by the legislature are passed overwhelmingly by overwhelming majorities of both Republicans and Democrats. It's only the few where there's a conflict that the media picks up on. And we have legitimate disagreements. I've become fond of saying lately that people, they see the battles, and what they don't focus on is what I have come to know is that all 90 legislators represent the views of their districts and try to vote that way. And that means that Oregon doesn't agree on everything. And so the tag is to try to find that out, and you have built-in battles. John and I joke a lot. I served in the House before as well. The difference between the House and the Senate, and you need to understand that each Senate district is made up of 2 House districts, nested House districts. House districts are smaller, and they tend to be very homogeneous or common in their perspectives. Senate districts usually include a large rural area along with that, and if we're trying to represent the whole view, there's a natural built-in clash between the two chambers. And if you look at it closer, the House districts, with now the Democrats in control of both chambers, most of the Democrats in the Senate, John accepted, well, no, you're in an urbanized area, but are in urbanized areas and have a very different view than the rural areas. And so trying to work out the compromises in that gets complicated sometimes. But that's kind of an over thing we will get done. The one thing that we will absolutely do at the end of the day, that's the only thing that's required of the Constitution, is when we adjourn in June, we will have a balanced budget. I think we're open to questions.
Yeah, so I just might say, senators introduce bills, representatives introduce bills, committees introduce bills. So there's multiple ways that we end up with thousands of bills to consider. And we end up at the end of the day, 800 or 900 of those maybe will get through the legislative session. So yesterday we were sworn in, and we had our first session in the House to read the first readings of the first bills. Now these are bills, we haven't even started the session yet. There is 55 pages, and these 55 pages are only the title, the number in the title. This has nothing to do with how thick the bills are, and we haven't begun yet. So when you go back to talking about what may be introduced about housing or land use, we haven't touched the tip of the iceberg yet, and so part of our job as legislators in that is to work with our leadership, the chairs of the committees, and sort out all of that to be able to focus on what the priorities are of all of this that can do the most good, and we will reach consensus on to address the issues that we're challenged by in the state. But it's not a simple process. So questions, comments from members?
680 bills.
Was there 680? Or started, yes.
So you were talking about the 4 different areas, and it's obviously we did talk about housing. So I guess it gets down to, what I'm curious about is, it gets down to where we get the money to pay for these things.
Right.
Obviously. Usually it seems to me the burden ends to fall upon small business owners, homeowners, or the average working class person with their state income tax. So if we really want to start, I believe that if we really want to start fixing things, the best way to do it is to raise wages of common working class people, because if they get more money, they can afford to pay higher rents. Right now, we're not keeping up with the cost of living. So, I mean, the legislature, are they going to be looking at anything about, again, raising wages, and also these big corporations that are not being taxed? We know, anyone with any common sense knows that the big corporations like Comcast and stuff are taking our resource, our money, pulling it out of the state, out of our country. You know, money's like water. We need it in our state in order for us to survive. So are there any ways that we're looking at maybe taxing the big guys and then we can give the workers and the small business owners and the homeowners a break?
So in the last long session, we passed a major change to the minimum wage law. So up over several years, it will keep ratcheting up in this state to where in some areas it'll be $14.75. I think instead of $15, we're in $15. So Oregon already took the initiative in that in the last long session and passed changes to the minimum wage law. Obviously, our minimum wage is substantially above the federal, and it's above Idaho. And so part of the problem with that is going to go back to rural versus urban. So we have part of our state in eastern Oregon that bumps up against Idaho. And so those businesses and people that live there are faced with, right across the river, businesses and people, their minimum wage is $7.25 for the federal thing. And so if we keep bumping up the wage in Oregon, what we see in eastern Oregon is a flight of businesses to Idaho. So in some cases it's counterproductive of what we're trying to accomplish. But we did, so we have the 3 regions in this state about how the wage ramps up, and we continue to do that. But we did take action 2 years ago, so we're on a plan right now to raise the minimum wage. Nobody believes that raising the minimum, even if we raise it to $15, provides people with enough income at minimum wage and say the 40-hour week that they can afford a lot of what we talked about here, even from housing. That doesn't take care of it. So there's a lot of other things. But so I think Oregon's been a leader in the minimum wage in trying to do that. But it is, quote, minimum wage.
But it does ratchet, pushes the others up.
That's right, and it pushes the others up. Goes back to right now, we're in a very healthy employment, and so, quote, unemployment is very low, which means there's a bigger competition for the employees that are out there, so having the minimum wage higher helps ratchet up and puts the pressure on it. And so hopefully, while we're in this good economic times, wages overall will grow some to do that. But the other thing about the wage side, so the wage side isn't the only part of that consideration. Costs go up. So we'll go back to wages. You know, I worked in the private sector my whole life, and I can tell you in the private sector, when we competed for employees and then raised wages, those wages have to be paid for by income or from some other source. And so depending on what that company is, or whether it's utility or somebody else, we can say, well, let's just raise the wages. We could do that, but that also increased costs that in many cases then diminishes the buying power for those people that we just raised the wages. And so there's a lot of things that are linked to that when we're talking about wages. But certainly the strategies that communities use and others for economic development and encouraging investment in companies and those that can provide wages higher than minimum wages have been a strategy that we'll continue to pursue in the state. And I chair the Economic Development Committee in the House this time. Those are on our agenda to talk about how we help communities support investments in key industries and other types of investments that will bring more jobs, different jobs that pay higher wages and can support people in doing those things. The tax, you want to talk about tax or do you want? I'll say it. So first, everybody just needs to understand that there's many of us would love to come up with $6 or $7 billion, and that's really if you take the requests that we've currently got out there from the students to underwrite the cost of tuition, from what we need in human services, we're talking more than $6 billion. There's none of us in the legislature are naive enough to believe even if we taxed corporations at the highest possible rate we could tax that we can raise $6 billion. We probably, the governor's investment package is $2 billion. It doesn't include some of the things that we've even talked about here tonight. $2 billion. It's a very heavy lift in this state and others. And here's part of the problem, and I tell my colleagues that in the House are tired of hearing this. If we could agree tomorrow to raise $2 billion that the governor's asked us for and make those investments, and so most of that investment would go through K through 12 education, to underwrite classroom size, to extend, so we're doing the full year. Most of it would go to K through 12, but at $2 billion, at the rate our costs are going up, half of that's eaten up in the next billion just by PERS cost. So part of the problem is, I'm going to go back to what we talked about housing, if we can't sustain it, then we're only fooling ourselves. So we could pat ourselves in the back this biennium and come up with $2 billion or $3 billion, part of the figure might be, and say we've addressed all these issues, but at the rate costs go up and continue to go up, come the next biennium, we're going to be right back here having the same conversation and saying, well, that was great. We increased taxes on corporations or whoever we increased it on, but it's not enough now to cover the increase on those costs and sustain those programs. So part of this conversation has to be about how we sustain it and how we address the cost increases in government in order to offset some of those costs so that what money we raise really goes to doing that. Corporate taxes is one of those on the agenda. It's been on the agenda for some time. Senator Hass in the Senate has spent a lot of time working on different scenarios of how that might work. Representative Nathanson from our area now is chair of the Revenue Committee in the House. They'll continue to work on some of those concepts that they had before. But I can tell you, in all the concepts we talked about before, they hadn't reached even the $2 billion level. So we'll just have to see where all they go. And that doesn't cover a lot of other potential issues that we have to address from a tax standpoint. So revenue is a big part of what this conversation is going to be about this session.
It's very hard. We like to talk about corporations. If you go back 30 years, Oregon had about either 10 or 12 Fortune 500 companies headquartered in Oregon. Today we have 2. We just don't have very many corporations. We have a lot of, when you look at the thing of corporations, we have a lot of corporations, but most of the corporations that we have are what's called S corps, they're family, they're small businesses, essentially that. We did have a ballot measure. I wasn't in the legislature, I think, well, I guess I was when by initiative a couple years ago on a gross receipts tax, which was a tax on business, and it was soundly defeated by the voters. So it's tough. I mean, the thing that we hear that I hear the most from the business community is we need a retail sales tax. Well, Oregonians have only considered that 29 times and voted it down 29 times. So, I don't hear a lot of support for that. So it's hard to get at that. There are things we can do, but it's really hard.
Well, I guess it's a recursive process. If we have the funds to invest in the infrastructure, the housing, the education, then we get a higher class of people coming out, and we have more people that are able to pay property taxes and say and not and the other that do conductive taxes. That's where this cycle goes. So if we invest $3 billion, can we get $3 billion more in productivity within the next biennium? Isn't that the question that we're trying to do? A foreign country like Singapore has taken their 1.8 million in 1965, and now they have 5.4 million, and they're the second richest economy in the world in terms of per capita income at $90,000 per capita.
A lot of people stacked on top of each other.
Well, it's 5.4 million people in the size of Eugene, Springfield. So but by doing that, and by having great controls over many other aspects, but I'm just saying that can we get the investment cycle going?
You just made the higher ed argument that we hear from the university presidents all the time. And the statistics, the demographics suggest that the more educated you are, the more likely you are to have a higher income, significantly higher with graduates. And I believe that, but you're not going to get a return in a biennium. If you start making that investment, you're looking minimum 10 years before you start seeing a significant feedback on that. Although I will say, and John may have a different opinion, we're hearing more and more from the people who are doing economic development now that what they're hearing from large companies that are considering other sites that they won't consider Oregon because of the lack of support for the education system. So it is starting to affect us.
I graduated from the university 40 years ago, and I've been a CPA for 25 years, so the tax issue, what I've seen on taxation in my lifetime is really quite tragic. When the Republicans cut the corporate income tax from 35% down to 21%, corporate profits in the United States are $2 trillion. That's 10% of our GDP. That's more than the military. That's more than Social Security and Medicare. That's how big corporate profits, just the profit alone, is in the United States. So the response of Congress was to cut the income tax rate from 35% down to 21%. So what the response from Democratic Party should be to take back that 14% at the state level. And get on down to ALEC. The Legislative Exchange Council still writes a lot of bills in this country, and get all the Democrats to just get back that and take back that 14% and get back some of that $2 trillion of the corporations' profits. Thank you.
So we did in the short session. So we did disconnect from the federal. So we did not pass it through, and we got criticized roundly by businesses in this state by doing that. But what we did was, we can't change the federal, but how our state tax is attached to it, we changed it. So what we changed was that in addition to the local businesses, didn't get that also deducted off from a state standpoint. And so we didn't raise their taxes, but we didn't pass through the federal additional tax rate. But that was very controversial. As you know, then the governor ended up recommending that we add some back for small businesses in specific, some tax breaks, incentives. Some people voted for that. I voted against it. That's the way the system works, but it worked in a special session. They passed it in one day to do that, but we tried in this state to run somewhat from that, but we can only do so much in the near term. But that'll be a part of the conversation we have this time about, you talk about corporate taxes, small businesses or large businesses, how that may all work out.
So I want to first start by saying thank you, Senator and Representative, for spending your evening here with us. It's greatly appreciated. I looked at some data a little bit ago, so my information that I have is a little outdated. It's from 2016. But here in the city of Springfield, there's just slightly under 50% of our citizens here are renters. And the price of eviction daily is, for a full week, it's about 5 evictions a week. And for Lane County, it's about 12 evictions a day. And these numbers that I'm pulling from are just for-cause evictions, not counting no-cause evictions because those are not tracked. The rising rents are going up. There is no cap on that. The cost of living is going up. The cost of moving is going up. Is there any accomplishments that you're hoping to get in this legislative session to support renters that are the majority of the residents?
Representative Lively was talking about that at the start here. There's a bill that has been worked out, well, it's been proposed, it hasn't been passed yet, that addresses no-cause evictions, at least in the first year. It talks about a cap on rent increases and a number of other features that people have raised.
Senate Bill 608.
So Senate Bill 608 would limit annual rent increases to 7% plus inflation. Once per year, prohibit no-cause evictions after 12 months of occupancy, provides that fixed-term tenancy becomes month-to-month tenancy if not renewed or terminated, and provides exceptions for tenancy in buildings that also serve as landlord's resident. Now, there's more to it than that, but that's one of the bills that's been introduced. There will be other bills that's introduced. I can tell you, though, currently, people in Portland aren't very pleased with this bill. So this goes back to how this works across the state and what we try to do from a state to address those things and how different communities, the dynamics in the city of Portland is very different than it is in most places. And so they, obviously in some cases, have already taken actions that would be far more stringent than what these are, but these actions would preempt communities from doing anything different than this. But this is kind of the first salvo in this conversation that you brought up about that, how we do that. 2 years ago, when the speaker had the bill and we talked about it, I talked with our community here in Springfield about rent control and how they felt about it. And the members that I talked to in leadership and others at the time weren't in favor of the state dictating rent control. They were in favor of having the conversation. And so I agreed to the bill that took off the preemption, that allowed communities to have those conversations so that Portland could do something different than Eugene and so on. But so I don't know where all that conversation has been in there, but that's one of the bills that's been negotiated and introduced at this particular time. People are certainly aware of that issue.
Mr. Van Lanning probably knows more about it than we do.
Yes, he does.
He's a negotiator for tenants in the news. I mean, I'll show you the irony of that, and I only know more about the Portland on this issue. But currently, Portland is very tight, in terms of report. They have 16, according to, this was about last October, commercial study on 16,000 vacant, what they call luxury apartments. 31 or 32 construction cranes building more apartments now. None of them affordable. And part of that is because you can't build one that's affordable in that marketplace without a huge subsidy. So I mean, that's the irony of it. I think in that marketplace, somebody's going to go bankrupt, and then maybe those units will be affordable down the road. Yes.
Representative Lively, among the bills that have already been introduced is one that you're the chief sponsor for, HB 2318, the Too Young to Test bill. Would you be willing to say just a very few words about that?
So, correct. So one of the bills I've introduced has to do with Too Young to Test, and it's talking about students through the 3rd grade, so kindergarten or pre-kindergarten through the 3rd grade. And this is, I mean, we hear a lot about testing in schools and about how much we do, and we have standardized testing, and I think many people agree that we've gone to an extreme in many cases on testing, and especially from the value of that. And so this bill tries to address, from a standpoint of in the early years of school and that, what testing really has value to help the educators and the students to learn and progress versus just testing for testing's sake. And so the standardized testing is an example. But it allows for testing to be able to understand and gauge where students are at and what additional assistance they need to reach those, but it would put some restrictions around in those early grades about how much testing, especially standardized testing. Not a slam dunk. It's a controversial to have the conversation. Part of the reason it's controversial to have it is we haven't resolved the issue about standardized testing in our school above the 3rd grade, and there's strong feelings. In this state, we have the ability to opt out. And so many of our schools, and Springfield is one of those examples, we have a high level of opting out of the standardized testing because in the state we allowed them to do it because we didn't believe we were getting the value of that. But our schools get penalized for opting out because they're judged on progression, and those students that are opting out count against the total students, but the school in many cases is a non-performing school. So we're trying to take a piece of that at the earlier grades to address the impact of that, and especially the impact it has on the students themselves, the too much testing and the mental and the strain that it puts upon those students. So I appreciate that they brought the bill forward. We're going to have the conversation along with many other bills, but there's pretty wide agreement that there is a valid concern about the testing and the value of testing, especially at the younger grades. So yes. Yes, go ahead.
Hi. When we saw in the Willamette Weekly the 7% plus the cost of living, there was a discussion. And the discussion amongst a lot of seniors is, I'm really fortunate, I'm not homeless yet, but this will drive me to homelessness. We have people who are really struggling to pay rent, and I can tell you right now, Social Security is not going to give people 7% plus the cost of living increase. And so I'm just wondering, as you guys are looking forward, debating your legislation, are you going to also take a look at how many seniors across the state of Oregon will be forced into homelessness each year as the 7% plus cost of living, which will be anywhere from probably 8.5%, 9% to 12% per year? What is going to happen to seniors, people with disabilities who right now are holding on with their fingernails and can't afford the rents they already have? Because you know when you do this, a lot of landlords are going to say, hey, I can do 7%. I know a lady here in Springfield who was told about, they were trying to make everybody in the mobile home court to do a 15-year lease, 20 pages long, and they were saying, oh, but you want to do this because we'll do 4%. I will bet you that landlord of that mobile home, owner of the mobile home court, who lives in California, is going to be really sorry that he tried to get the majority of those people to sign that before December 1st, because now he's going to be like, oh, we thought we could lock in 4%, we could have locked in 7%, plus cost of living.
Who knows where the conversation will end up. At the end of the day, the reason we have the conversation is to see if we can find common ground to do something. And so there's nothing in place today that addresses this issue from a standpoint of rent increases. So we tried last session, we were successful. This is an attempt to see if we can find a common ground to start doing something about it. Whether that's where we end up, I don't know. But if we don't end up somewhere in some common ground, we won't have changed the denominator, the problem, which the problem is the rents are going to continue to go up even at potentially a faster rate. I just want to say something else about seniors and then housing, and especially those that own their home. So the other part of that equation becomes property taxes. And we've reached a real point in many of our communities, the property tax rate on those people with fixed incomes that do own their homes, that is jeopardizing their home ownership in order to pay the property taxes. So if you look at the issues we have to address in the legislature, is so how do we address the property tax issue? Because we've restricted it with Measure 5, but the only choice communities have, schools have in that, to build is bonds that have to be repaid through property tax. Just like Senator Beyer talked about the bonds we have to repay with general funds, So there's a lot of issues out there, but this particular issue, if we don't find a common ground to do something, then we'll just continue in the course that we're on right now. So like I say, there'll be multiple bills, there'll be conversations about it. I don't know where the legislature in total will end up regarding those issues. Okay, Chris.
Thank you, Representative Lee, Senator Beyer, Chris McAllister. I had a couple of questions regarding homelessness and housing, but in regards to the seniors, to the disabled, and the people at the Camp 99 camp, like I just have to move out. We're finding that as seniors have the rents go up, the inflation goes up, it only goes so much, so far. We propose some ideas to our city and our county governments to try and help fix it on a grassroots level. And there's opposition because there's not enough support from the state. There's not enough support from Portland. How can we foster an environment, local decisions, local needs for our local homeless, for our local people in the mobile home parks? How can we incentivize them to stay here, for the monies to be built here, and projects to come up from here? Because every time we ask for help from Salem, they say talk to Portland. We call up Portland, no, when are you guys going to get money? So they said they can't really get any change without Portland being part of the block. And if Portland has urbanization and big building and big spending as part of its goal, and we're talking about how we're going to shave off this or shave off that to keep these things open, how can we find that kind of dynamic? We're always going to be shifting and going. We have seniors who cannot afford, with $1,500 a month, to move into a new place. On disability, good luck if you get evicted, and a lot of our people are just saying, well, don't get evicted and you won't have that problem. So what is the answer? How do we get foster change?
I'll let the senator answer that
one. Chris, I think we just spent the last 2 hours talking about that. I don't know that there is a good answer. I mean, we've been talking, like John was saying, we spent last session talking about a bill, didn't get there, couldn't get agreement. We got another one this time to do that. Some of the housing stuff, I guess I would challenge, I don't know if you were here earlier when these people were talking, but the legislature has put more money into the system the last 2 budgets and has quadrupled it in the next one. So it's not a lack of money. Well, it is a lack of money, but it's not that the legislature hasn't been trying to put some money into it. But again, it's a competition for money going there.
So it seems stuck in the middle is all. And the bottom people we're always fighting for the middle class, but there's no war for the poor. So where do our poor get help?
That's what these people are trying to address. They're here. I mean, we're trying, we just can't build it fast enough.
Thank you.
So we've used our allocated time that the city allows us to be in this facility. I want to thank all of you, and here's what I encourage you to do, is as the session gets started and you hear or see things, contact your representative if you have questions about that you can't find otherwise, or if you have concerns. But remember, this is a several month process, and you're going to hear and read things out of the chute. It's going to frighten us all, but that doesn't mean that's where we're going to end up. But there's going to be some pretty crazy things, even I might introduce them, I don't know, that people will introduce that won't ever get to the finish line, but we got to sort out those kind of things. But so I just encourage you to, we have, I believe, 90 elected representatives, senators, and representatives of the state that really are there to do the work of this state and want to do it in the fashion that we do it in Oregon, and we need to find a common ground forward. But we can't panic what the media may or may not say about what's happening in any given moment, because at any given moment it may change again before we reach the finish line. But watch it, hold on to your seats, and contact us if you have questions or suggestions of what we can do.
Just one comment about that. It's really easy to let us know what you're thinking about. I'm not going to try and give you an email address. If you just type into your computer Oregon Legislature, it will bring up our homepage, and the House or the Senate has the members. You just click on our picture and it will send an email.
Oh yeah, Jerry.
Can I just say, keep the conversation going. Springfield City Club this Thursday, meeting at the Hilton Garden there in Gateway at noon, is going to be talking about taxation and the history of taxation in the state. And my son-in-law, Dave Hunt, is going to be one of the presenters. Also, Barnhart is going to be there, and I can't remember the other former representative who's going to be there. But This is an opportunity to get more information and talk about it, keep the conversation going. I think that's so important. And you're invited to come to any and all city council meetings and participate if you like. You can get 3 minutes at our regular meetings to come and say whatever you need to say.
Thank you again for coming and moving.